Why isn't there any consistency when it comes to the injuries of these 4 victims in the Idaho 4 crimes? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And before I get into this video, I want to let everybody know that beginning this weekend, I'm going to be doing my first video about the Delphi case. Now, I'm familiar with this case, and I remember when this case first occurred years ago. I began following this case back when it first happened, and there was a lot of twists and turns in this case. There was a lot of secrecy and mystery surrounded by this case. So now we have some new information, and now we have a suspect in custody. So beginning this weekend, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the Delphi case. Now, let's get down to the information that I wanted to share today. And basically today I want to talk about the injuries that were sustained by these victims in the Idaho 4 case. So I'm going to be talking about different sources who have made statements, as well as referring back to the PCA. So we're going to start on the top floor because that is where law enforcement believes that these crimes began. Now, Kaylee and Maddie were in Maddie's bedroom sleeping in her bed when these crimes began. And it's never really made sense to me why Kaylee and Maddie would be sleeping in Maddie's bed. Mainly because, I mean, it's not odd that two friends would sleep in the same bed, but it just seemed odd that Maddie's bed was just a twin-size bed. It was a very tiny bed for 2 people to sleep in. So I always wondered why Maddie and Kaylee didn't sleep in Kaylee's bed if they were going to sleep in the same bed. Kaylee had a bigger bed than Maddie, and Murphy was also in Kaylee's bedroom. So it really never made sense to me why Kaylee would sleep in Maddie's bed when Maddie just had a little twin bed, and why leave Murphy locked in your room? Why would Kaylee leave Murphy locked in her room and go sleep in Maddie's bedroom? That's just always been odd to me. So we're going to start at the top floor. Now, Maddie and Kaylee's wounds were described as sharp force trauma. So both of them had been stabbed, and that's how their injuries were described. Now, there's not a whole lot of information about Maddie's injuries. I believe that Maddie, at the time of the crime, she definitely could have been passed out or sleeping. She did appear to be very intoxicated at the grub truck. So it would make sense that maybe she went home and went upstairs and went to bed. Now, Kaylee, her injuries were a lot more extensive than Maddie's. Now, Steve Gonzalez, he described Kaylee's injuries and Maddie's injuries as being very different, completely different. So Maddie and Kaylee's injuries were not consistent with each other. Now, we don't know if the weapon that was used was consistent, but we know that the injuries that they sustained were not consistent. They were not the same. Kaylee's injuries were described as much more brutal and much more extensive. It's reported that, that Kaylee's body had over 50 puncture wounds. So the whoever committed these crimes inflicted quite a bit more damage on Kaylee than they did on Maddie. Now, we also know that Kaylee fought back, which I guess raises another suspicion, because if Kaylee fought back and she had defensive wounds, and they know that Kaylee fought back, why were Kaylee and Maddie laying side by side in Maddie's small twin-size bed? They were laying side by side. So either Kaylee was trapped behind Maddie, or she put up a fight. I mean, it seems like you couldn't have both. She would either have to have been attacked while she was behind Maddie and pinned in between Maddie and the wall on the bed, or she fought back. So it seems like it would need to be one or the other. Now, the coroner, Kathy Mabbitt, in the beginning, in her very first interview after these crimes, she stated that all of these victims were in beds. They were basically creating the narrative that all of these victims were in bed asleep during the time of these crimes. So the coroner stated in this interview that all of the victims were in beds, which we know that that's not true. We know that they weren't all in beds. So it's strange that she would say that, because it seems as though she would have seen the crime scene. Now, after Kaylee and Maddie's lives are taken, we're going to go downstairs. And this is where Ethan and Xana's lives were taken. Now, sources say that, and this is in the very beginning of the investigation, and when these crimes first occurred, when information was coming out. Now, sources say that Ethan had a fatal injury to his neck caused by a sharp-edged object. Now, this is a different type of wound, because this isn't a puncture wound. This is a slicing wound, or what they would call it was an incise wound, which is basically a slashing wound. Now, it was, a source reported that his neck contained an incise wound, and that Ethan was right outside of Xana's bedroom door in the hallway. Now, Ethan also sustained blunt force trauma, allegedly, which, a blunt force trauma could come from an object, a fist, a golf club. So he had what would be considered blunt force trauma as well as sharp force trauma. So he had sharp force injuries, which sharp force injuries could be caused by stabbing, by slicing, or by chopping. By chopping with a lot of force behind the weapon, whether that be a sharp-edged blade or whether that be a tool. Chopping would be more traumatic to the skin and the muscle around these wounds because of the force of this weapon entering the victim. So Ethan's injuries were described a little differently. They weren't really described as just stab wounds as they were with Kaylee and Maddie. So Ethan's now in the PCA, it states that Ethan was found deceased and that his wounds were later determined by an autopsy report. So these wounds weren't evident to law enforcement when they first saw Ethan's body. Whereas when they first saw Maddie and Kaylee's body, as they stated in the PCA, it was very apparent that they had visible stab wounds. So these were visible when they first walked into Maddie's room and saw Kaylee and Maddie. With Ethan, his injuries were later determined through an autopsy. Now Xana, we know that Xana fought back. Xana's dad made a statement that the coroner indicated to him that Xana had fought back. Xana had defensive wounds to her hands and her fingers, which would be considered more slicing wounds, which would be from grabbing the blade and pulling the blade through, almost severing the fingers, allegedly. And sources also said that Xana, now this is what sources have said, that Xana also sustained a fatal wound to her neck as well, a slashing wound. Now, puncture wounds are going to be different than incise wounds or slicing wounds, because typically puncture wounds aren't going to bleed as much. Typically, slicing wounds are going to be very messy typically and are going to bleed a lot. Typically, that victim will bleed out. So there was a variety of injuries in these Idaho 4 crimes. Ethan's wounds had to be determined at a later time in Spokane, where the autopsies were performed. So the coroner couldn't immediately identify Ethan's wounds. So Ethan didn't have obvious stab wounds as Maddie and Kaylee did. Ethan had different wounds. Xana had different wounds. She fought back. Now, Ethan was not described as having defensive wounds. So we're unaware as to whether Ethan fought back or not. Because it seems as though if Ethan fought back, he would have defensive wounds. And those wounds would have been listed in the PCA. But they're not. Ethan's wounds were not described as stabbing. So basically, upstairs on the 3rd level, where Kaylee and Maddie were sleeping, that's where the stabbings happened, was where Kaylee and Maddie were sleeping. Now on the 2nd level, where Xana and Ethan were located, there's a variety of injuries described on this 2nd level. Steve Gonsalves describes the scene as a battle. Steve Gonsalves stated that the coroner told him that there was a hell of a battle going on down there, assuming that she meant downstairs from the 3rd level, on the 2nd level. So it sounds like the 2nd level where Ethan and Xana were is the area where there was a lot more chaos going on, which is, approximately 15 feet from Dylan's bedroom door. So it would have been very hard it would be very hard to believe that Dylan didn't hear everything that was going on. But we're not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to talk about these injuries. But the injuries don't appear to be consistent from victim to victim. And that's kind of a big deal, because why would the same suspect commit these crimes in a variety of different ways? We don't know if there was more than one weapon used to commit these crimes. I believe that there was more than one weapon used to commit these crimes. I feel like it's a little far-fetched to believe that one victim committed these crimes in the manner that this suspect committed these crimes with one single knife. That just doesn't make sense to me. So when you go through the information about their injuries, and there's a lot of information we don't know about their injuries, of course, but when you go through the information that we do have about their injuries, in my opinion, it indicates that there was a variety of injuries caused by possibly a variety of weapons, which would contradict what law enforcement believes, and that is that there is one suspect who used one weapon. So these injuries, the injuries that these victims sustained is important. It tells us a lot about how these crimes were committed, the manner in which these crimes were committed. A variety of injuries with a number of weapons would indicate that there was more than one suspect who committed these crimes. It doesn't appear that all 4 victims' lives were taken the same in exactly the same manner. The injuries aren't consistent, which would lead me to believe that there were possibly more weapons used, possibly more suspects. So I do believe that there was definitely more than one suspect. I don't believe that Bryan Kohberger would have been able to pull off these crimes on his own. What do you all think? Leave it in the comments. Tell me what you think about, do you believe that there was really just one suspect? Or does it make more sense that there would be multiple suspects inflicting multiple wounds on multiple victims? Let me know in the comments. Please like and please subscribe to my channel if you like my content. Like I said, I've got a lot coming up with this channel. This weekend, we're going to start talking about the Delphi crimes. I've had a lot of requests to talk about the Delphi crimes, and I am going to jump back into that and do a deep dive into that crime. And we're going to start talking about that this weekend. So thank you to everybody who follows my content and subscribes to my channel. I really do appreciate it. It really means a lot to me. And we'll see you next time.